All right. So welcome, everybody. My name's Alex Wilson. If you haven't met me before, I'm an accredited mental health social worker and I'm the director of Mindful Recovery Services and the Central Coast DBT Centre in Erina, New South Wales. So today we're going to be talking about building resilience in teens. So this webinar is suitable for anybody, but particularly if you have a teen in your home, if you know any teens, this webinar will hopefully be helpful for you too. Oh, I've frozen. There we go. I'm back. Okay. Yeah, so I work a lot with teenagers. Myself and my team specialize in treatment of complex mental health conditions for teens and adults. So we see a lot of teens for a variety of reasons that have trouble regulating their emotions. So I'm going to give you a little overview today of maybe just some helpful perspectives to understand emotion regulation in teens, and then what to do when emotion regulation is maybe proving difficult, how to support those teens and ourselves, because let's be real, it can be hard and stressful when you have a dysregulated teen in your life. I have one too. Mine is 14 on Saturday. So let's have a look here. Oh, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Like I said, if you don't already have a copy of these slides, you'll get copies, but you can feel free to follow along if you like. Alrighty. There we go. Presentation mode. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Why do teens struggle with emotions? Or why do some teens struggle with emotions? Okay, so there's a few things here that we want to understand. First of all, there can be biological factors, okay? So we know that some people are born with a predisposition to feel emotions more intensely than others, all right? So some of us are just born feeling more, right? This is not a bad thing. It can be a really helpful thing in regards to people who experience their emotions more strongly are usually really great with things like empathy, connection with others, things like that. However, of course, if we are born with this predisposition to feel things very intensely, we're also going to feel things like pain, hurt, sadness more intensely too, okay? But we do think that there is, we are born with a certain level of, sensitivity to emotions. So that can be going on, right, with a teenager, that they have that predisposition. Another thing that can be going on is things like autistic spectrum disorder. We know that kids with ASD struggle to regulate their emotions more than those without that diagnosis. This isn't something wrong with their brain. It's just, different brains. But certainly in my clinic, we see a lot of kids with ASD that struggle with emotion regulation. We also know things like anxiety and depression. So clinical anxiety or depression is obviously going to make it harder for a teenager to regulate emotions. Now, anxiety and depression are kind of these broad terms, right? And so a clinical diagnosis of anxiety and depression might be different to just like I'm feeling anxious or I feel depressed. But certainly if we see a teenager who, is on antidepressant medications or has had really intense panic attacks and anxiety, that's going to make it much harder for them to regulate emotions. And interestingly, an area that I've been learning about more recently is gifted teens often struggle with emotion regulation. There seems to be just a bit of a gap there around gifted teens. And I'm not talking here about just kids who are smart. I'm talking about kids who are in this gifted category. Again, it's probably a type of neurodiversity. They learn very quickly, but there seems to be a bit of a gap where they understand at a cognitive level some high level concepts, but emotionally and socially, there's a bit of a gap there. And so that can also lead to big emotions and difficulties with those. So those can all be factors, right? Biological factors. We also know that with teens, brain development, right, makes it harder for them to regulate emotions. So a teenager's frontal lobe, which is where all our emotion regulation and rational high-level thinking lives, is not fully developed yet. That's still growing to mid-20s at least, right? So they literally don't have the brain structure to regulate the same way a 30-year-old would. Although I would argue there are 30-year-olds who really struggle to regulate too. So, and we can't blame their brain structure for that necessarily. But this, also with teens, this might contribute. Puberty and hormonal changes, we know that stuff obviously can make emotion regulation more difficult. Some level of emotion regulation difficulties is actually really normal for teens. It's developmentally appropriate. They're figuring out how to manage their emotions and how to manage their behaviors, and they're learning consequences of, different things. So some level of that is normal. And I don't know many people that get through having a teenager without some level of emotional outbursts. But the issue, I guess, is in how severe is that? Right? So if it's really problematic for that young person, problematic for the family, causing a lot of distress, then we may want to look at giving them some additional skills and tools. And of course, we don't want to discount environmental factors. Trauma is a huge reason for emotion regulation difficulties. And I'm going to touch on trauma a little bit more in a minute. Sometimes if teens haven't had a great modeling of good emotion regulation, for example, if we grow up in a household where we have a parent who is very shut down emotionally, that can have a negative impact. Or if we have a parent who is, really struggles to regulate and they have a lot of outbursts, that can be difficult for a young person. Sometimes we get both, right? In a family, we might get one parent who's more shut down and one parent who's more kind of chaotic. And for a young person, that's obviously confusing, right? It's hard to know what to model there. Also, factors like bullying, social relationships, these can all contribute to difficulties with emotion regulation. So a little bit more on trauma. So we have really extensive research that shows trauma in childhood results in emotion regulation difficulties. That is one of the biggest impacts of trauma. It also disrupts development of a healthy identity, and also often affects the ability to form healthy connections with others. So we know that these are the impacts of trauma. And when I say trauma, I'm using a broad definition here. I'm including acts of commission. So these are, physical abuse and things like that, things that have happened to the person. But I'm also including acts of omission, which we now know from the research can be just as damaging. Some research is indicating that acts of omission may even be more damaging than acts of commission. But acts of omission are things like a lack of healthy attachment. So something happens in the parent-child relationship and the attachment is disrupted, right? Or not established. Things like lacking emotional validation in early childhood and emotional connection. We know these can have a really big impact on children's brains. So, how do we understand emotional resilience? Now, long-term emotional resilience actually relies on our ability to tolerate episodes of short-term distress. So that's what long-term resilience is. It means I can ride the ups and downs of life without frequently going into overwhelm. Yeah, that's what it looks like to be emotionally resilient. It doesn't mean there's no triggers. It doesn't mean there's no difficulties. In fact, emotional resilience shows up when we have difficulties, but we manage to get through without going into overwhelm, right? We're still going to be upset. We're still going to be, emotional, but we're not going to have to stay in bed all day or harm ourselves or shut down, right? We're still going to be able to get on and do what we need to do. Many teens and adults, okay, engage in behaviors to avoid sitting with distress in the short term. Now, this makes sense because as humans, we are averse to pain, right? We don't like it. We don't like to sit with it. When we experience emotional pain, our first urge is to find a way to get rid of it or get away from it, right? So a lot of, in teen years, a lot of teens start to use avoidance behaviors when big emotions show up, and that can then carry on, well into adulthood. What happens when we develop a pattern of avoidance behaviors is we actually reduce our long-term emotional resilience. This is demonstrated most easily in the distress tolerance curve. If you've done training with me before, you'll recognize this. This is basically a way of understanding distress and avoidance, okay? So on the bottom axis, we have time. On the up axis here, we have distress. Now, emotional distress could be any strong, unpleasant emotion. It could be hurt, pain, sadness, fear, anything that feels yucky. And distress goes in waves, right? It goes up, it reaches a point, it comes back down. Joy does that too. All emotions go in waves, right? Emotions never stay exactly the same forever, right? And we know this because if I say to somebody, hey, have you ever felt better than you do right now? They'll say, yeah. And I'll say, have you ever felt worse than you feel right now? Sure. So that proves to us that emotions change. So distress goes up, it reaches a point, it will always come back down given enough time. People's distress curves can look different. So this is a nice even distress curve. Some people's distress curve is very up to 5, down to 1, like very distinct, where they feel like they just go 0 to 5, 5 being the highest level of distress on this scale. 0 to 5, boom, 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 right? All day long. Some other people find they go up to a 5 and they stay there for a long time before they come down. We call that a slow return to baseline. We know that that can occur, with different sorts of, brains and mental health conditions. But given enough time, distress will always come back down eventually, right? The problem is that when we experience high levels of distress, particularly for teenagers, they experience high level of distress for some reason. And what happens is their brain starts to tell them this big red arrow that's pointing up. Their brain starts to say, uh-oh, distress is going to keep going, right? It's going to go to infinity unless I do something to get rid of it, right? Now, this is a false belief, but this is a very powerful belief that our brain will start to tell us of like, oh no, I've got to get rid of this distress. It won't come down on its own. This is where we start to engage in problem or avoidance behaviors. Avoidance behaviors, just like they sound, get rid of distress instantly, right? They allow us to jump off the distress curve and give us a bit of relief. They may not drop us down to a 1, but they'll give us a bit of relief. That blue line you can see that I've dotted across, what that represents is the top of this curve is where we start to go into our fight, flight, freeze mode, which you may have heard of. This is where the body starts to go into kind of adrenaline overload. Our ability to rationally think really shuts down. So the hardest part of this curve to get through is the top. And the hardest part to, not avoid is the top, right? That's when it's hardest to kind of hang in there. But you can see what's happening in this diagram. Let's say as a teenager, I experience something that triggers a lot of distress. Maybe I have a big fight with a friend, okay? My distress goes up to level 5. I feel overwhelmed. I start to think, oh my God, this distress might not go away. And then I find an avoidance behavior that gets rid of it really quickly. Let's say I go and drink some vodka, okay, behind the school sheds, whatever. Bang, distress gone. All right. My brain remembers that. So the next time I experience distress, I'm not going to wait till I'm at a level 5. I'm going to drink the vodka at a 4.5. It's just common sense because I'm thinking it's just going to keep going, right? And then the next time I'm jumping at a 4, the next time at a 3. What's happening over time, the more I use my avoidance behaviors, my tolerance to distress is going down. So whereas I maybe used to be able to tolerate very high distress without avoiding. Now, maybe I'm down here at level 1, where even just anticipating distress is getting me avoiding. We see this often in teens where there's an increasing pattern of school avoidance. It might start out with missing a day here and there. It gets more and more frequent, and it turns into they're not going at all, right? Their distress is as high as ever. In fact, probably higher. Their tolerance to distress has gone down because they've been doing so much avoiding, right? We often see this with self-harm as well, where I've worked with young people where they might self-harm in the morning before school, not because they're distressed, but because they know they're going to be. So they're just getting in front of it. Makes sense, right? This is not a broken brain. This makes sense to the brain. The problem is, in the long term, this makes life so much harder. Our distress tolerance has gone down, but also now we've got all these problem behaviors that are causing consequences too, right? We're in trouble with mum and dad, we're in trouble with the school, we're in trouble with the police, whatever. We got like a triple whammy going on here. So that's a dilemma. Some examples of problem or avoidance behaviors. These work very well in the short term, okay? But they do make it worse in the long term. Isolation and school avoidance. So literally just not going out, just refusing to go out, right? If I don't go to the trigger, I can't be triggered. So I'm going to stay home. There's a lot of consequences of that, obviously, in regards to learning and social development, and also just a sense of self. Self-harm is unfortunately a very popular way that people avoid. Self-harm and suicidal behaviors are different. The intent is different, but self-harm, the intent is to get relief from distress. Suicidal behaviors are wanting to not be alive anymore, right? And suicidal behaviors are the most extreme avoidance behavior that people can engage in. Often suicidal behaviors will start to show up when there's been a lot of other avoidance behaviors over time, and that's sort of the natural progression of things, unfortunately. So we want to intervene early so that we can get on top of these avoidance behaviors. Drug and alcohol abuse, a lot of adults use this too, right? Disordered eating, right? So we're not talking here about strictly anorexia. We're talking here more around the restrict, binge, and purge cycles that young people can get involved in. Often they are very effective at getting rid of emotional distress. Anger and aggression, also, very effective avoidance behaviors. If I scream at somebody or punch them, I feel better for a moment, right? So they work. Let me know in the chat if you can think of any other avoidance behaviors. An avoidance behavior makes us feel better in the short term, but makes it worse in the long term. For adults, we could look at things too, like overworking, over-exercising, right? For some people, that's an avoidance behavior. For some others, it's a healthy behavior. So sometimes it's also about what extreme are we going to. So the other thing we want to understand is there's a really important relationship between the level of emotional distress someone is experiencing and their level of tolerance to distress, okay? So, and I'm going to show you a diagram in a moment, which will explain this better. If my distress is higher than my ability to tolerate distress, I'm going to be in overwhelm. Oh, David's put computer games. Yes, gaming can certainly be a problem behavior when taken to the extreme. Thank you. Good point. People with high levels of distress and or low distress tolerance can get in these really chronic patterns of problem behaviors. Let me show you here. Okay, so on one side of this slide, you can see the green dot is the level of distress. Okay, so that's how much, level of distress tolerance on this side. So that's how much I can sit with unpleasant emotions. Remember, if I've been using a lot of avoidance behaviors, my distress tolerance is going to be lower. But if I haven't been using a lot of avoidance behaviors, maybe my distress tolerance is okay. On the other side, we see the level of emotional pain or distress. Now, in this diagram, you can see my level of distress tolerance is higher than my level of distress. This is what doing well looks like. Okay, I'm functioning. Again, it's going to be things that are coming up, but I'm functioning. I'm doing okay, right? When we change that, my level of emotional pain is up here. My level of distress tolerance is down here. This is what crisis and overwhelm look like. This is where I'm probably going to be engaging in a lot of problem and avoidance behaviors, right? Interestingly, it actually it can also look like this. So maybe my level of pain is here, but my distress tolerance is really low. This is still overwhelm. Same as if my pain is very high, even if my distress tolerance is pretty good, if the pain's higher, it's still overwhelm. So it's the relationship between these two that makes the difference, as you can see here. So here we have someone who maybe has actually a very high level of distress tolerance, but they've got something that is triggering a lot of pain for them. So they're going to go into overwhelm. That's okay if it's temporary, right? The problem is when this is chronic. Same as down here, right? Maybe my level of emotional pain today is actually pretty low, but my distress tolerance is through the floor. Leaving the house is difficult for me. This is still going to be crisis and overwhelm. So what do we do? Well, there's two things here we can do, right? One thing we could do is if we could try and reduce the level of emotional pain and distress, okay? The things that do that are usually things like trauma therapy, long-term psychotherapy. There are, of course, brief, shorter modes of therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that, which maybe bring down a little bit of emotional pain and distress. If someone's got a lot of emotional pain and distress, particularly related to trauma, long-term psychotherapy may be what's going to be most helpful. This takes time for a lot of people. There's not a lot of very quick ways we know of to permanently reduce distress in the long term. It takes time. We've got to kind of rewire how we do things, how we think, our understanding of things. We've got to process difficult emotions and memories in a safe space. There's a whole bunch of things that go into that. It takes time, right? But we can do that. The other thing we can do, though, is that we can increase our level of distress tolerance. This is the faster way, okay? It is much quicker for me to learn skills, because there are specific psychological skills to increase distress tolerance, right? I can do that pretty quickly. I don't even have to touch the level of pain. If I increase my distress tolerance to higher than my pain, I go back to feeling okay, right? So this is the quicker and easier way to do it. I say easier. Of course, it's not easy, but it is quicker. In an ideal world, and so when I work with people long term, we do both, right? So we will, first of all, I will teach them skills to increase their distress tolerance. That's phase one. And then as we work on the pain and the sources of pain, hopefully that starts to come down too, right? So we get this really nice buffer zone so that even if pain goes up, they're still doing okay. Even if it goes to here, they're still doing okay, right? Because like life happens, triggers happen. So I like my clients to have this, right? A nice big gap between the two. So we've got some wiggle room. So what we're talking about here is moving the goalposts, right? So a lot of people come to someone like me because they want to get rid of distress, right? They're in a lot of pain, and just people out there, people who aren't seeking therapy, like, I just want to get rid of my distress. And they might think of all the different things to do. They might buy all the books or, get rid of gluten or whatever, right? Get rid of the distress. But I want you to think about shifting the goalpost. The solution actually lies in building tolerance to distress. Okay? Whatever we do with the distress, whether we manage to solve it or not, building tolerance to distress is going to be very helpful and very important. So this shifts our focus, because if I'm trying to get rid of distress, I might start to avoid a lot. I might start to, I'm not going to leave the house. I'm not going to go to school. I'm not going to do any of this stuff. Instead of, how can I build tolerance? In order to build tolerance to distress, we have to be willing to experience some of it, right? Without going into overwhelm. And we need new skills and strategies to do this. So I'm not suggesting that people are just like, oh, silly people, they don't know how to build distress tolerance. Nobody teaches us, right? Who is teaching us how to sit with very strong, unpleasant emotions? Now, maybe our parents, but maybe not. School, maybe not, right? So who's teaching us? And it's not fair to ask, particularly a teenager who's got all their brain and hormonal stuff going on. It's not fair to ask them to act differently unless we're going to teach them how to do it, right? So, what can help? When we think about building resilience and teaching skills, here are some things we might think about. So, skillful distraction. This is something that, in my practice, we do a lot of looking at skillful distraction. Now, I want to add a caveat here. We don't want people to distract all the time. That's avoidance, right? We're trying to reduce avoidance. However, when I'm at the top of my distress curve, when I've hit overwhelm, distraction can be a very helpful thing to buy time. Remember, the distress will come down on its own. And if I can ride out these waves of distress without jumping off, without avoiding, I am building up my distress tolerance. Okay. I'm building up my sense of confidence too, that I can ride out distress without doing problematic behaviors. So simple distraction can be great. One of the problems is we often don't think about it until we're in our level 5 crisis. And then we're like, I can't think of what to do. I'm just going to freak out. So we want to think about distraction skills before we get in the crisis. I often recommend to my clients that we write lists, right? So I get them to write a long list of what are helpful distraction skills for me. I'll get them to put them in their phone or somewhere, really easy to get to. And I'll say, so when you notice your distress is getting really high, or when you notice you're in overwhelm, I want you to start at the top of your list and I want you to work your way down. And if you get to the bottom of your list and you're still in overwhelm, start at the top again. Okay. Time will take care of it. Every time we can ride out a wave of distress skillfully without avoiding, we're building resilience. Okay. So some really popular things in this category are like music, making a distracting playlist. I suggest things that are, maybe upbeat or relaxing, right? Rather than music that's maybe going to escalate distress or feed it, right? I do have some clients who love heavy metal and that's on their distraction playlist. And look, whatever works for you. But just be mindful, if you're listening to a certain type of music and it's making you feel worse, maybe switch it up, right? So I'll get them to make themselves a playlist of music that's their go-to playlist when they need a little skillful distraction. We can also use media. I mean, everyone's got a phone in their pocket, right? So I could engage with like different videos online. I know my clients will often talk about like, funny animal video accounts or comedy accounts or things like that. That again, kind of, the aim here is not to get rid of to get rid of distress instantly. That would be an avoidance. I'm just trying to do something that doesn't make it worse, right? So again, like comedy, humor, things like that, or even like inspirational media that they might find helpful. So I'll get them to like tag, certain accounts that can be their go-to when they need that just a little bit of distraction. Physical movement can always be helpful. So exercise or just like getting out and walking or doing something, getting up and moving in some way, right, can really help give us something else to do while we're riding that wave. Helping others can be a great distraction. So this is where we shift the focus from self to others. It could be calling up a friend who I know is having a hard time and asking them how they're going. It could be jumping onto online chat forums and, giving people kind of encouraging or validating comments. It can be any of this stuff, volunteering to help somebody with something, doing something nice for a family member or a friend. This is really, really helpful distraction too. And it has a knock-on effect of improving relationships. So win-win. Sensations are another great idea for distraction. So it could be things like eating like sour warheads, or sour lollies, or eating a chili, right? I had a client who used to eat really strong mints as a distraction, and that really worked well for him. He could carry them anywhere. It could also be things like, having a cold shower. What else? Some people talk about holding ice cubes. The problem is we're sometimes not around ice cubes, so that's a little tricky. But anything that creates a strong sensation that's not self-harming could fall into this category. Also, games, puzzles, things that involve distracting our thoughts. So games on their phone, doing a little puzzle online, the Wordle, whatever, can be a nice little distraction as well. So maybe getting them to put some of those things on their phone ready to go as well. Okay, so you can see there's like lots of different ideas. There's way more that, that I haven't listed here, but it's really, I get them to basically brainstorm and then I'll prompt on some of these ideas and I just want them to try some things, right? They may be like, oh, I don't think that'd work. Well, you know what, try it anyway. Let's see. And typically what they'll find is there'll then be a handful of distractions that become their go-tos, right? That work really well for them. So again, just be mindful. We don't want distraction all the time. We only want to use distraction when we're in that kind of the hardest part of that distress curve. The rest of the time, we want to be noticing and validating emotions. But distraction is great to prevent overwhelm. Another set of skills that you may have heard of are skills to change body chemistry. So these are what we call TIP skills. They come from dialectical behavioral therapy, which is obviously my specialty. And they basically are skills that have been shown to very powerfully change our nervous system. So when we're in overwhelm, we are in our sympathetic nervous system, which is getting us ready to fight, flight, or if we can't do that, to freeze. Adrenaline, cortisol, all of that's going on. And our ability to think really goes offline. So TIP skills help us settle that down and get our parasympathetic nervous system, our relaxation nervous system to kick in. So TIP skills basically involve, there's a skill where we get them to put their face into a cold sink of water and hold their breath. That's a very powerful way to settle adrenaline in the body. Intense exercise is a great way to do this too. Now, this is exercise that's probably about a 7 out of 10, a 7 to an 8 out of 10 on their exertion scale. So whatever they feel is a 7 or an 8 out of 10 for them for at least 15 minutes. That will drastically change body chemistry. And if you work out, you know that, right? Like you always feel calmer after a workout. This is why. Paced breathing is a breathing technique that we know can be very helpful. Now, this is a focus on long exhales. So on the exhale is when our heart rate slows, okay? So we get them to breathe in and then we get them to exhale as long as they can. We sometimes teach like an inhale for 4 and an exhale for 8. The counting doesn't really matter as long as the exhale is twice as long as the inhale or more. For younger kids, we teach this, we have them blow bubbles through a bubble blower. It's that kind of paced breathing. And we have a muscle tense and release exercise. It involves tensing paired muscles on both sides of the body for 15 seconds and releasing. Fists are an easy one here. I get them to tense up their fists for 15 seconds and then a full release and repeat. Okay, so those are very powerful skills to help change body chemistry. If you want to teach these to kids, the best way is to practice them yourself and then teach them, right? To say, hey, I found this nifty little skill, or I heard about this nifty little skill that can help if you're feeling overwhelmed. They'll work very well in a panic attack, these skills. Do you want to practice them together? Do you want to try them together, right? And see if you can glean some interest. We also have on our website a bunch of blogs and videos and things like that that they can also get into if they want to learn it that way. We also know that mindfulness practice can be really helpful. Now, mindfulness practice when we're in a state of overwhelm is going to be very difficult unless you're very experienced. But mindfulness practice, when, maybe distress is there, but it's not in overwhelm, mindfulness practice for that can be really helpful. So there's lots of good apps. I've mentioned some of them here. Smiling Mind is a free app that's great. Headspace UK, I think you get like 10 free sessions on that. The Calm app is really good. There's lots around now. And if you just Google like guided mindfulness, you'll get a whole bunch of different things. We've got really good research to show that people that practice mindfulness regularly have far less activation in their fight-flight part of their brain. And they can switch on their relaxation system more easily. So it's a great skill. And I know a lot of young people who really like those apps. Now, just a note, none of these skills are going to give the same release as their avoidance behavior, right? So let's say my avoidance behavior was self-harm. Distraction's not going to give me that same instant relief. However, it'll give me some relief and it will help me build distress tolerance, right? It'll help me build long-term resilience and not make things worse. So that's something that I always like to just tell people about. Don't expect the exact same, oh gosh, that's better, but you'll get a little bit of relief and it'll be easier next time. Some other things to think about with building resilience. So for people that maybe need a little bit more help, for teenagers that need a little bit more help, they can get into a DBT program. So like here we have a 12-month program, a 12-week program. We do individual programs as well, have a whole range of things. We've got some online programs. And we basically teach them distress tolerance skills in a lot of detail. So that's a great option for young people if they need it. Regular mindfulness practice, which I mentioned, but them getting into like a daily practice where even they do 5 minutes of mindfulness at the beginning or the end of the day. Maybe as a family, you do it together or you do it with them at night or at different times, not when distress is high, but just as a regular practice. Very, very, very good for brains. There's some research that's been coming out that's showing that mindfulness practice may be just as effective for depression as antidepressants. Now, take that with a grain of salt because there's lots of different types of depression and different symptoms, but we know it's very good for brains and it's free. So that makes it easy. Another thing that we can look at with building resilience is challenging false beliefs about distress. Now, this is something that we talk about a lot in therapy. There's a lot of beliefs that we're all holding, and teenagers hold them too. Things like, I can't cope with feeling bad. I can't stand this feeling, right? Or some teenagers believe that feeling bad is dangerous. Like they really believe that if they don't avoid their distress, it will harm them in some way. What's interesting about that when we unpack it is that it's avoidance behaviors that cause harm. It's not the emotions, right? Emotions can just make us feel bad and uncomfortable for a while. It's the avoidance of emotions that can be very dangerous. So we like to make that distinction and to gently sort of explore, like, what is my teen thinking emotions can do to them? And can we start to talk a little bit about maybe thinking about that differently? About, yeah, like it feels super uncomfortable, but did you know that emotions on their own, all they can do is just make us feel bad for a while, right? So we can do some talking and teaching around that. Building safe and secure relationships is obviously a really big part of building resilience. Now, for teenagers, they can often benefit from healthy relationships with adults who are not their parents. So, like my eldest son, for example, he has no interest in what I have to say about his emotions or about how to manage them or how to feel better. No interest. But he might listen to his music teacher, right? Or he might listen to my brother, his uncle, right? So sometimes it's also about finding like, who are those other healthy adults? I stress the word healthy, right? Healthy adults who teens might be connected with already, who might be able to, do some talking about these things with them and just giving them some encouragement around this stuff, because it's very normal for teens to pull away from their primary parents and carers, right? Don't take it personally. It's just development. It's what they do. But those other healthy adults can really help. One thing we can do as parents is we can validate getting through hard times, right? And validation is different to praise. Okay. Validation is, talking to somebody's like internal values, strengths, that sort of thing, right? So praise might be, oh, you did really well in that soccer game, you scored a goal, well done. That's praise. Okay. It's not bad, but I'm validating an external achievement, which can sometimes backfire. Instead, to validate might be like, I really respect how kind you are to your teammates, or I really noticed that you got through that tough time the other day really skillfully. I really respect that, right? So we're finding these inner things about our teens to really validate. And that we can also validate unpleasant emotions, to say, that sounds really hard. That sounds really difficult. How can I help? Right. Without going into fix it mode. I know as a parent, I often will go into like, how do we fix it? When sometimes what's needed is me to actually just show that I understand. And if there's a teen who does have some trauma in their past, then a staged, or sometimes called a phased trauma therapy approach, might be helpful. So this is important. We never want to put a teenager into trauma therapy and say, just start talking about your trauma. Okay, that can be overwhelming. It can make problem behaviors escalate. It can make them feel awful. We need to go slow and steady. First, we need to establish a good relationship. Then we want to teach them skills for everyday life to feel better. And then, and only then, would we maybe do some trauma work. Okay. Or some don't, right? It's not necessary to talk about trauma, to heal from trauma. But for some people, that's part of their journey. And for some, it's not. There's some therapies around at the moment who are sort of touting like a quick fix to trauma. Be very, very careful with that. There is no quick fix to trauma. It might look like a quick fix. I assure you it's not. So trauma therapy work is highly relational. It's very dependent on a therapeutic relationship, and you have to be very careful doing it. So just be careful with that. We always like to build skills first. I've put a little illustration of that in a moment, which I'll talk to. Now, another thing to be mindful of, if distress is very high, and or distress tolerance is very low in a teenager, you might need some specialist help. If risky behaviors are present, this is especially important, right? Around getting a specialist in the area of treating risky behaviors in teens on board with you. Just something to keep in mind, because it's really nerve-wracking for parents, and you need some help with that. And again, just bringing in somebody who does this as their bread and butter work can help reduce risk. We need a safe and secure therapeutic relationship in order to teach distress tolerance skills when there's lots of risky behaviors going on. Okay. And again, as I said, mindfulness of past trauma has to be respected and not pushed too soon. So we unfortunately see clients that come to our clinic where a very well-meaning therapist has pushed them into talking about trauma, and their distress tolerance is too low and they get worse, right? So we need to be really careful about that. This is the model that myself and my team all work from. So when we work with young people, particularly those that are doing a lot of those very risky behaviors, their distress is very, very high. Their distress tolerance may be low. A lot of them have trauma histories. First, we build relationship, right? We have to build safety. Nothing good is going to happen if we don't do that. And that takes time, particularly with a young person who's been hurt by people before, does not trust, doesn't want a bar of it, isn't interested. I'm just here because mum told me to come, all of those things. So that takes time. Once we've established some relationship, we can then start to encourage skills, although we can teach skills pretty quickly. There are some skills young people take to pretty quickly, like those skills that change body chemistry fast. They'll often grab onto those pretty quick, and we'll start to get some movement. But long term, skills take time and, you know, are in the context of that relationship. And then we start to see, you know, a lot of change. Again, we can see some skill development pretty quickly, but, you know, real long-term change with really complex presentations takes time. And sometimes we need to go back and forth. We're like, oh, I've pushed too hard. I need to go back to the relationship, right? So this is sort of, you know, just to have in your mind how we might approach it. So what can you do to help your teen? Now, obviously, some of those skills I've talked about, you can talk through with your teen. Also, the most powerful thing parents can do to help their teens is to learn how to do and model distress tolerance skills, right? And so this means that we have to take a really honest look at ourselves with no judgment, okay? Because we're often a product of our parents, right? How good are my emotion regulation skills? How good is my distress tolerance? How much am I avoiding, right? What teens see in their caregivers is the most powerful impact. It's not what I say, it's what I do, right? So I could work on my own distress tolerance, right? And that would be super helpful for my teen just by watching me. Also, we know that as humans, when we're in the presence of someone who's very well regulated, our brains actually change to kind of come down to match that a little more closely. So if I'm really dysregulated and the person I'm with is really dysregulated, we're kind of like triggering each other to become more dysregulated. And just like if I'm really regulated and this teenager is really dysregulated, my regulation, my calm, my patience, all of that, my compassion is going to help their brain kind of come down to this level. So that's just modeling, right? And that's, again, a lot of what we do in the therapy room too, is that we try and model really good, you know, regulation, because we know that brains are kind of communicating on a nonverbal level there. We can learn how to listen and validate. Again, as I said, it's not just praise. It's really about finding those things about your teenager that we can pull out and really validate when they've done something really amazing, or there's something about them that we respect, or whatever. We can encourage healthy habits. I know this is easier said than done. Sleep. You know, can we try and help our teens get good sleep? They actually need 9 or 10 hours a night. They need a lot of sleep, but their circadian rhythms are all different, right? So they want to stay up later, get up later. School doesn't allow for that. That's a problem. But certainly figuring out, and I suggest a negotiation approach, right? Hey, so I want to make sure you get enough sleep because sleep is really important for your well-being. And my job as mum is to keep you healthy. I understand you want to stay up late. How can we negotiate this? What seems fair, right? Exercise. So again, like, how do they get out? How do they get active? Encouraging that. Pets are great for that too. In fact, I'm a big believer in pets just generally. I have a dog that I often bring into the clinic that people just love to hang out with. But getting out and walking a dog, playing some sport, things like that, great for exercise. And nutrition. Are they eating enough? You know, if like my son, like he won't eat anything all day, and then he'll come home and just raid the cupboard continuously for, you know, a 6-hour stretch. That's fine. I just need to make sure that I'm catering for that, right? And that we've got enough variety and nutrients and things in there. If your teen has extra challenges, so autistic spectrum disorder is being, you know, very broadly sort of diagnosed now, more recognized. ADHD as well. So again, we know kids with these issues may struggle to regulate emotions more than others. So we give them a little bit of extra help, right? If they're struggling with anxiety and depression, you know, or trauma, particularly if there's trauma, I really recommend getting a professional to help you and to help your teen together, because that's complicated. And as I mentioned, healthy relationships with adults outside of the parents can be healthy, but make sure they're healthy. Some resources for you if you're interested. So we've got a couple of things on our website. I've got a DBT for Parents course. It's all self-paced, it's online. That goes through in a lot of detail distress tolerance skills, validation skills, a whole bunch of stuff. It's basically a little crash course in DBT for parents. I've chosen the most relevant parts of DBT that I think are great for parents, and I've popped them in there. So there's that. I've also got a self-harm in teens parent guide. So that's specifically for parents who are worried about or experiencing self-harm in their teenagers. That includes a lot of stuff about safety planning in there. We also offer parent sessions at our practice. Even if your young person is not a client, we do those. If you go into our website, which is mindfulrecovery.com.au, click more and you'll see a program list. Under that, you'll find all of those things. Or that's my direct email. Copy that down. You can also just email me and be like, Alex, where's your stuff? Show me. And I've popped some books in here for you too. So we've got the DBT Skills Workbook. This is a self-help workbook. It is appropriate for teens and adults. It's one of the more popular ones that my clients have used and quite like. So that's a really cost-effective way, again, to kind of build different skills and build this idea of long-term emotional resilience. We've also got a couple of DBT workbooks for teens. I've heard good things about these ones. And then we've also got by Sunny Jane Wise, the Neurodivergent Friendly Workbook of DBT Skills. This workbook, again, really suitable for teens or adults, and very user-friendly way to learn some different skills and strategies. So great for you and great for your teens. All right. So that is the end of my presentation. We have a few minutes for questions. Would anybody, you can either take yourself off mute or you can pop stuff in the chat. A chance just to ask anything or even just offer a reflection on anything today. Was it new or did it reiterate maybe stuff that you already knew? Go for it. You can jump in on the chat or you can speak, totally up to you, whatever your preference is.
Good day, Alex.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Is that Solomon?
Yeah. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm very good. I have one question, like, what about the parents' overprotective behavior to their children?
Yeah.
Something like they're bounding them into the one place, and then they're like the parents have the anxiety,
Yes.
and they feel like unprotected for their kids, and they're keeping them into the protective situation. So what
Yes.
does it give a boost to the teenage, like teens problems?
Yeah, great question. So overprotection is not great for teens because what we're doing there is we're facilitating avoidance, aren't we? So it comes from a really well-meaning place, you know, and parents that I've met that kind of do these patterns are often, you know, just they're coming from a place of just wanting to keep their teens safe. Sometimes parents might have their own histories that are kind of getting triggered as well. Perhaps there's some reason that they think the world is a really dangerous place and they feel they need to wrap their teen in cotton wool. Maybe they did some crazy stuff as a teen and they're like, you're not doing that. Whatever it might be, it's a reflection of an emotional trigger for the parent. So the parent is triggered into a fear state, which is causing them to be overprotective. So what we want to understand about that is that, you know, risk-taking and exploration is really important for teenagers. Now, obviously, we want to intervene if it gets really dangerous, but our job is to be a safety net for the teenager to go and come back to. There's some parenting programs like Circle of Security, things like that, which teach a model for parents of like, you need to let go sometimes, right? And you need to sit with the fear and discomfort of that. That's your stuff. That's not your teenager stuff. That's your stuff that's being triggered. You got to work on that. If you need to get into your own therapy around that, do that. But your teen needs to go out into the world and then knows that they can come back and they regularly come back to you, which you are the safe place here. You're the hub. And then they go out again and they come back, and they go out and they come back. And it's really important that they do that. But it's often hard for parents to know when they're being triggered in their own stuff, well, how much should I let them? Am I being too permissive? Am I not? And that's where getting, another opinion can be a good idea from a professional or from somebody that you trust to tell it to me straight. Am I being overprotective? What do you think? If your teen is saying you're being overprotective, I don't have any freedom, probably listen to that. It's probably worth checking out. It can be hard when teens say things like, well, my friends get to go out all night and I should be able to do that. That's not necessarily reasonable, but they do need some freedom to make mistakes. They need some freedom to find their own sense of identity. Their job is to disconnect from parents in meaningful ways. So yes, you raise a very good point, but that is definitely a parent issue. That parents need support around to be able to reduce that fear. Again, I find there's often some good reasons that fear is coming up for parents, their own stuff, which we can bring a lot of compassion to, but we can also challenge.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I saw a little comment here in the chat. Let me bring that up. Yep, Misty. Lots to think about. NDIS changes. Do you know if the DBT parents course can be claimed through NDIS? I'm interested to learn more about DBT. Yeah. So the online parents course cannot be claimed through NDIS. It's I think it's at $197 at the moment. So it's pretty it's pretty cheap. If you can save up for that. But yes, no, I'm not aware that is covered. Parent sessions face-to-face, though, may be covered under NDIS, depending on the plan and who's involved and things like that. They may be. We certainly have a lot of NDIS clients that come and do our 12-month program. As part of that 12-month program, we do parent sessions. So they are included in that. So that's how a lot of our NDIS clients also, we get parents on board. And the way we do that is we'll have one therapist working with the child, and then we'll have another therapist who works with the parents, usually me. So that, again, the teenager feels that they still have their privacy and confidentiality in their own therapy, but we're also able to support parents and, troubleshoot whatever's going on, help build skills, figure out whose stuff is this? Is this mum's stuff? Is this son's stuff? Is this dad's stuff? What's coming up? So that often works quite well. You asked, I think there was another question in here too. Oh, David, do you see more boys than girls, and why might this be so? So historically, we've seen more young women come through our practice, but that seems to be changing. So this year in particular, we've had a real increase in young men coming through. And some of that might be the increase in, again, ASD diagnoses and ADHD diagnoses that are coming through. The younger generation of teens also seem to be a little bit more aware about trauma and about the impacts of trauma, and they're sort of maybe a little bit more willing to talk and address that sort of stuff, and that includes boys. But yeah, we are definitely seeing more boys, and yeah, I'm not entirely sure why, but that's a good thing. Most of the boys that I think are probably coming under that sort of ASD, ADHD kind of banner. We have had some, though, with sort of major depressive disorders and things like that. So yeah, it's great to see that we're now probably seeing equal amounts when previously it was more women. Cool. Any final questions? Thanks, Simone. No problem. So if you have anything that comes to mind or that you didn't want to ask live here, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to chat with you there, or you can also message me through the website or our social media. Feel free to reach out, if you just want to have a chat or you're not sure about things or you've got some questions. Mental health services are very difficult to navigate. It's very confusing to figure out, what is the best path and what does your team need. So I'm happy to, help guide you if that's of interest to you. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks to you all for joining me. Bye.